They say you never know someone's true worth until crisis strikes. At First Regional Bank, Michael Chen was just the janitor they all ignored, the silent man with the mop who kept to the shadows. None of them could have guessed that this humble cleaner was once a decorated Marine, or that his military skills would turn him into the unlikely hero who would save dozens of lives during one of the most daring bank heists in Pine Grove's history. This is the story of how a forgotten veteran proved that true courage never fades. It just waits for the right moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Pine Grove was the kind of forgotten place where dreams came to die, a small town trapped between fading memories of better days and the harsh reality of the present. The morning sun cast long shadows through the bank's pristine windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air despite Michael Chen's relentless efforts to banish them. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle with the same precision they once held an M4 carbine, though no one here knew about that part of his life. At exactly 6 a.m. each morning, Michael would slip through the employee entrance, his faded blue uniform blending into the background like a ghost. Tom, the security guard and fellow veteran, would offer his usual nod, their shared military past creating an unspoken bond that needed no words. These quiet moments before the bank came to life were Michael's favorite, when he could work in peace without the weight of judgmental stares and whispered comments. "Chen," Victoria Blackwood's sharp voice shattered the morning calm. The bank's executive manager stood at the top of the marble stairs, her designer heels clicking against the steps as she descended. "The quarterly board meeting is today. I expect this place to be immaculate." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed his work. "And try to stay out of sight when they arrive. We don't need to remind them of our overhead costs." Michael straightened instinctively, muscle memory from years of military service kicking in. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The Purple Heart medal in his apartment drawer seemed to burn in his mind, a reminder of a life where his worth wasn't measured by how invisible he could make himself. As Victoria disappeared into her office, Sarah Martinez, one of the younger tellers, caught his eye. She reminded him of his sister back in California, before the war had created an unbridgeable gap between them. Sarah was one of the few who treated him like a human being, sometimes leaving him coffee or thank you notes that meant more than she could know. "Don't let her get to you," Sarah whispered, pretending to organize pamphlets at her station. "Some people wouldn't know real strength if it mopped their floors every day." Michael managed a slight nod, focusing on the rhythmic movement of his mop across the floor. In the break room nearby, he could hear two loan officers talking, their voices carrying through the thin walls. "Did you hear about Chen? Apparently he was some kind of war hero," one said with a hint of disbelief. "Hard to imagine looking at him now. Guess some people just peak early." "War hero to floor hero," the other chuckled. "Victoria says he barely speaks, probably shell-shocked or something. Better to just keep your distance." The words settled on Michael's shoulders like the Afghan dust that still haunted his dreams. 13 years had passed since his last deployment, but time hadn't dulled the memories. It had only pushed them deeper, like shrapnel too dangerous to remove. His hands remembered the weight of responsibility, the lives that had depended on him during countless missions. Now those same hands cleaned windows and polished floors, their strength and skill hidden beneath layers of invisible scars. Tom caught his eye from across the lobby, a knowing look passing between them. They both understood what it meant to carry the weight of the past while the world moved on around them. Michael continued his work with military precision, each movement calculated and efficient. His trained eyes still instinctively noted the exits, tracked movement patterns, assessed potential threats, habits that had kept him and his unit alive in the war zone. But here in Pine Grove, in the sterile halls of First Regional Bank, those skills seemed as useless as the metals gathering dust in his drawer. The only battles he fought now were against dirt and grime. The only territory he defended was the square footage of polished marble floors. Or so everyone thought. None of them could have known that fate was about to prove just how wrong they were about the quiet janitor who haunted their halls. Sometimes the most valuable soldiers are the ones hiding in plain sight, and Michael Chen's war wasn't over just yet. The afternoon sun streamed through First Regional Bank's windows, casting long shadows across Michael Chen's freshly mopped floors. He watched as bank employees hurried past him, their expensive shoes leaving scuff marks he would need to buff out later. The board members had arrived for their quarterly meeting, each one dressed in tailored suits that probably cost more than his monthly salary. Victoria Blackwood had made sure he stayed in the background, cleaning the far corners of the lobby where he wouldn't disturb their important proceedings. As Michael worked, his mind drifted to his small apartment across town. The space was sparse, military neat, with bare walls except for one framed photo of his old unit in Afghanistan. Sergeant James Martinez, his best friend, stood next to him in the picture, both of them grinning despite the desert heat and constant danger. James hadn't made it home. Some nights Michael would sit in his threadbare armchair, staring at that photo, wondering if he was honoring his friend's sacrifice by living this half-life. The sound of raised voices drew his attention back to the present. Victoria was berating a new teller, Amanda, who had apparently made a mistake in balancing her drawer. "This is exactly why we can't trust newcomers with responsibility," Victoria snapped, her voice carrying across the lobby. "If you can't handle basic arithmetic, maybe you should consider a different career path, perhaps janitorial work." She shot a pointed look in Michael's direction, drawing uncomfortable laughs from several nearby employees. Michael kept his head down, but his jaw tightened. He'd seen that look before, in the eyes of civilians who thought veterans were damaged goods, broken tools to be discarded. The same look he'd gotten from potential employers when he first returned home, before he'd finally accepted this position at the bank. His therapist at the VA would call this a triggering moment, but Michael had learned to channel his frustration into his work. During his lunch break, he sat alone in the maintenance closet, eating a simple sandwich while reviewing the bank's layout in his mind, an old habit from his Marine days. He knew every corner, every blind spot, every potential entry and exit point. The security cameras had blind spots he'd noticed months ago, but when he'd tried to mention it to Victoria, she'd cut him off with a dismissive wave. "Stick to what you know, Chen. Leave the security concerns to professionals." Tom, the security guard, stopped by briefly to share a coffee with him. "Rough morning, brother?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Saw what happened out there?" Michael shrugged. "Nothing I'm not used to." "You know what gets me?" Tom said, lowering his voice. "How they think this job makes us less than what we were, like somehow pushing a mop erases everything else." He tapped his chest where Michael knew a silver star lay hidden beneath his uniform. "But we know better, don't we?" Before Michael could respond, Victoria's voice rang out again. "Chen, there's a mess in the conference room that needs immediate attention." He could hear the smirk in her voice. "Unless, of course, it's too complicated for your skill set." Tom shook his head as Michael stood up. "One day they're going to realize what they've got in you, brother." "Maybe," Michael replied, though he didn't believe it. He gathered his cleaning supplies and headed to the conference room, where he found coffee deliberately spilled across the expensive carpet. He recognized the handiwork of Derek, one of the loan officers who seemed to take particular pleasure in making his job harder. As he cleaned, Michael could hear snippets of conversation from the board meeting in the adjacent room. They were discussing security measures, of all things. "Our current protocols are more than adequate," Victoria was saying. "We've never had a serious incident, and upgrading the system would be an unnecessary expense. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Michael thought about the blind spots again, about the outdated cameras, about the lack of proper emergency protocols. His military training screamed at him that this was asking for trouble, but his position demanded silence. He was just the janitor, after all. What could he possibly know about security? Later that afternoon, as the day wound down, Sarah approached him while he was cleaning the ATM vestibule. "I saw what they did in the conference room," she said quietly. "It's not right, how they treat you." Michael continued working, but he appreciated her concern. "It's just coffee," he replied. "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Sarah hesitated, then continued. "My brother served too, you know. 2 tours in Iraq. He had a hard time when he came back. Still, does sometimes. But he found people who understood, who helped him remember his worth." Michael paused, looking at her fully for the first time. "How is he now?" "Better. He runs a veteran support group in the city. You should come sometime. It's not good to carry everything alone." For a moment, Michael was tempted. The weight of isolation had been growing heavier lately, pressing down on him like the Afghan sun had years ago. But before he could respond, Victoria's voice cut through their conversation. "If you have time for chat, Chen, perhaps you need more work to do. The vault area needs attention, and the night cleaning crew called in sick. You'll need to cover their shift." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Michael shook his head slightly. "Yes, ma'am," he said, turning back to his work. As Victoria walked away, satisfied with her power play, Michael caught a glimpse of his reflection in the bank's window. The man staring back at him wore the mask of submission well, but underneath something else stirred, a spark of the Marine he used to be, waiting for a reason to reignite. He didn't know it yet, but that reason was coming sooner than anyone could have imagined. Night had fallen over Pine Grove, and First Regional Bank stood silent except for the soft sounds of Michael's work. The double shift Victoria had assigned him meant he'd be here until midnight, alone with his thoughts and the ghosts that never quite left him. The bank's security lights cast strange shadows across the walls, reminding him of night patrols in Afghanistan, where every shadow could hide a potential threat. In the empty building, Michael allowed his rigid posture to relax slightly. He moved through the corridors with the silent precision that had once kept him alive in combat zones, his footsteps barely audible on the marble floors. The silence was both a comfort and a curse. It gave him peace from the day's humiliations, but it also left too much room for memories to surface. He paused near the vault, remembering a particularly bad nightmare from the night before. He'd been back in Kandahar watching helplessly as an IED took out the lead vehicle in their convoy. Sergeant James's voice had crackled over the radio. "Chen, we need you." But this time, like every time in the dream, he couldn't move fast enough. The explosion's echo had jolted him awake in his small apartment, sheets soaked with sweat, the taste of desert dust in his mouth. The VA counselor had told him these episodes might never fully go away. "It's not about forgetting," she'd said during one of his monthly sessions. "It's about learning to carry it differently." But some burdens felt impossible to shift, especially when each day seemed designed to remind him of everything he'd lost. Michael pulled out his phone, checking the time. 10:30 p.m. As he did, his finger brushed against a photo in his gallery. His graduation from Marine Corps training, standing proud in his dress blues. His mother had been there that day, beaming with pride. She'd passed away while he was deployed. Another moment he'd missed, another weight he carried. His sister had never forgiven him for not making it back for the funeral, though he'd been in the middle of a critical operation at the time. The sound of his cleaning cart's wheel squeaking brought him back to the present. He moved to the break room, where morning's conversation about him still hung in the air like stale coffee. Opening his small locker, he caught sight of the newspaper clipping he kept hidden inside, a yellowed article about his unit's rescue of a village from insurgents. The headline read, "Marines show extraordinary courage under fire," but now it felt like it was talking about someone else entirely. Sarah's words from earlier echoed in his mind. Her brother's veteran support group sounded like something his counselor would encourage, but the thought of facing other veterans, of acknowledging his struggles openly, made his chest tighten. It was easier to disappear into the routine of his work, to let people see only what they expected to see. A noise from the lobby made him freeze, instincts suddenly alert. It was probably nothing, the building settling, the heating system kicking in. But old habits died hard. He moved silently to investigate, remembering similar moments of tension during night patrols. The bank's cameras had blind spots he'd mentally mapped months ago, and he found himself automatically checking them as he moved. The lobby was empty, but something felt off. Maybe it was the way the streetlights cast shadows through the front windows. Or maybe it was the same sixth sense that had saved his life more than once in combat. Michael made a mental note to mention it to Tom in the morning, though he knew Victoria would dismiss any security concerns he raised. Returning to his cart, Michael pulled out the small notebook he always carried. In it, he'd sketched detailed maps of the bank's layout, noting security vulnerabilities out of habit, the kind of tactical assessment that had once been part of his daily routine. Some nights, when the silence became too heavy, he would review these notes, his mind automatically planning response scenarios for various threats. It kept his tactical thinking sharp, even if no one here would ever know or care. The distant sound of police sirens drew his attention to the window. He watched as patrol cars sped past the bank, their lights painting the empty street in flashes of red and blue. Somewhere in the city, someone was having a worse night than he was. The thought didn't bring comfort, but it did remind him of something his old commanding officer used to say: "The quietest soldier might be the one you need most when all hell breaks loose." As midnight approached, Michael began his final rounds. He checked each floor methodically, testing doors, noting anything out of place. In the executive offices, he paused at Victoria's desk, where a framed photo showed her accepting an award for excellence in banking leadership. The irony wasn't lost on him, how people like her earned recognition for their visibility, while others stayed hidden in the shadows, keeping their world running smoothly. Tomorrow would be another day of the same routine, another day of being invisible. But as Michael finally prepared to leave, he caught his reflection in the darkened windows. Behind the janitor's uniform, behind the stooped shoulders and quiet demeanor, he could still see traces of the Marine who had earned that Purple Heart. That man wasn't gone, just waiting. For what, he didn't know, but something told him he would find out soon enough. Morning arrived with a biting chill that seemed to seep through the bank's thick walls. Michael arrived earlier than usual, his body stiff from the double shift the night before. The sun hadn't yet risen and Pine Grove's streets were still dark, scattered pools of lamplight creating islands in the pre-dawn gloom. Something about the morning felt different. There was a heaviness in the air that reminded him of moments before firefights, when the world seemed to hold its breath. Tom was already at his post, but something about his posture caught Michael's attention. The security guard was more alert than usual, his eyes scanning the street with focused intensity. As Michael approached, Tom spoke in a low voice. "Had a report of suspicious activity near banks in neighboring towns. 3 robberies in the past month." He paused, meeting Michael's eyes. "They're professionals. Military precision, according to the reports." Michael nodded, his mind automatically shifting into tactical assessment mode. He'd noticed 2 unfamiliar vehicles during his walk to work, a dark van parked across the street and a sedan with tinted windows at the corner. Nothing concrete, but enough to raise the hair on the back of his neck. "Have you told Ms. Blackwood?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Tried to," Tom replied, frustration evident in his voice. "She said we're not paid to chase shadows. Besides, according to her, our security system is state-of-the-art." The sarcasm in his voice was clear. As if summoned by their conversation, Victoria Blackwood's voice cut through the morning quiet. "Chen, what are you doing standing around? The board members will be back today to finalize their quarterly review. I want this place spotless." She strode past them, not even acknowledging Tom's presence. "And remember what I said about staying out of sight." Michael watched her disappear into her office, then shared a knowing look with Tom. "I'll keep my eyes open," he said quietly, pushing his cleaning cart toward the lobby. Tom's warning had heightened his senses, bringing back the hypervigilance that had kept him alive in combat. As he cleaned, he began mentally cataloging everything that could be used as a weapon or barrier if needed, a skill he'd hoped to never need again in civilian life. Sarah arrived an hour later, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Michael with a warm smile. "You looked tired," she said. "Heard Victoria made you pull a double shift yesterday." Before he could respond, she lowered her voice. "I talked to my brother about you. His veteran group meets tonight. I could give you the address." "I appreciate it," Michael said, his voice soft but firm. "But I'm fine." The coffee's warmth spread through his hands, a small comfort against the morning's chill and his growing unease. "You know," Sarah persisted, "being strong doesn't mean carrying everything alone. Sometimes the bravest thing is asking for help." Her words hit closer to home than she could have known. They echoed what his commanding officer had told him after they'd lost James. Words he hadn't been ready to hear then, and maybe still wasn't. Before he could respond, Victoria emerged from her office with several board members in tow. "As you can see, gentlemen, we've maintained the highest standards of security and service," Victoria was saying, leading them through the lobby. "First Regional prides itself on being the most secure banking facility in Pine Grove." As they passed, one of the board members wrinkled his nose at Michael's cleaning cart, as if its mere presence offended him. Michael continued his work, but his mind was racing. Through the front windows, he noticed the dark van had moved closer to the bank. A man in a business suit had been standing at the ATM for 10 minutes without conducting a transaction. Small details, probably nothing, but in Afghanistan, noticing small details had meant the difference between life and death. He made his way to Tom's station, pretending to clean nearby. "2 men at the ATM," he said quietly, not looking directly at his friend. "They've been casing the entrance pattern." Tom gave an almost imperceptible nod, his hand unconsciously moving closer to his holster. "The cameras in the East Corridor are still down for maintenance," Tom replied softly. "Victoria hasn't approved the repair budget yet." Michael absorbed this information, adding it to his mental map of vulnerabilities. He'd served with men like these potential robbers, veterans who'd taken their training down darker paths. Their methods were familiar, their patience professional. As the morning progressed, Michael watched the subtle signs accumulate. More unfamiliar faces entering the bank, some with suspicious bulges under their jackets. The way they checked sightlines and exits, trying to look casual, but displaying the controlled awareness he recognized from combat training. He thought about warning Victoria again, but knew she would dismiss his concerns as paranoid ramblings from the unstable janitor. Sarah caught his eye from her station, sensing his tension. She'd been a good friend to him, one of the few who saw past his uniform to the person beneath. If his instincts were right about what was coming, he silently promised himself he'd do whatever it took to keep her and the others safe. Perhaps that's why he'd been here all along, not as punishment for his past, but as preparation for this moment. The bank's clock showed 10:45 a.m. when Michael noticed the final sign. The subtle nod between 2 men near the entrance, the kind of silent communication he remembered from combat operations. His muscles tensed as years of training came flooding back. In his mind, he could hear Sergeant James's voice from their last mission together. "Trust your gut, Chen. When it all goes to hell, that's what keeps you alive." He was no longer the invisible janitor. He was a Marine again, and the battlefield was about to become First Regional Bank. The first gunshot shattered the bank's morning calm like a thunderclap. Michael was in the East Corridor when he heard it, followed by screams from the lobby. Time seemed to slow down as his combat training took over, his body moving with practiced precision even as his mind cataloged every detail. The sound had come from a high-caliber handgun, likely a .45, professional equipment, just as he'd suspected. "Everyone on the ground now," a commanding voice echoed through the lobby. "This is a robbery. Cooperate, and nobody gets hurt." The voice was controlled, disciplined, military training, without a doubt. Michael could hear the panic spreading through the bank, the sounds of people dropping to the floor, someone crying. Victoria Blackwood's voice cut short mid-scream. From his position, Michael could see into the lobby through the reflection in the glass of a framed corporate achievement award. 4 men had entered, 2 covering the main entrance, 1 moving toward the teller stations, and their leader heading straight for Victoria's office. They moved with tactical precision, covering angles, maintaining clear lines of fire. These weren't ordinary criminals. They were trained operators. Tom had drawn his weapon, but one of the robbers already had him in their sights. "Drop it, rent-a-cop," the man growled. "We know you're the only armed security on duty." Tom hesitated, then slowly placed his gun on the floor. Michael watched as they zip-tied his friend's hands, forcing him to kneel with the other hostages. Through the same reflection, Michael saw Sarah at her teller station, her face pale but composed. She was slowly reaching for the silent alarm button, but Michael knew it would be too late. These men would have already disabled the main alarm systems. They'd done their homework, probably had inside information about the bank's security protocols. Michael's mind raced through his options. The maintenance closet where he stood contained cleaning supplies, tools, and access to the building's maintenance tunnels. A detail he'd noted months ago but never thought he'd need. He could easily slip away, ensure his own safety. But that wasn't what Marines did. That wasn't what James would have done. The leader's voice came again. "Ms. Blackwood, so nice to finally meet you in person. You're going to help us access the vault. And before you think about being heroic, remember, we know about the secondary security protocols, the backup silent alarms, and the police response times for Pine Grove. We've planned for everything." Everything except me, Michael thought, already formulating a plan. He knew he had to act fast but smart. These men were professionals, which meant they'd have contingency plans and wouldn't hesitate to use lethal force. But their training might also be their weakness. They'd expect resistance to come from security or law enforcement, not from a janitor they'd probably already dismissed as irrelevant. Moving silently, Michael opened his cleaning cart's lower compartment. Beneath the supplies, he kept a small toolkit for basic maintenance. It wasn't much, but in trained hands, even simple tools could become effective weapons. He selected a solid metal wrench and a screwdriver, tools that felt familiar in his grip, reminded him of field-stripping weapons in the desert. The bank's layout played through his mind like a tactical map. The maintenance tunnels connected to the old pneumatic tube system, unused now, but still accessible. They ran behind the walls of the vault area, another detail Victoria had dismissed when he'd tried to point out this security vulnerability months ago. Now it might be their only advantage. Michael could hear the robbers organizing the hostages, moving them away from windows and doors. Their leader was still with Victoria, his voice carrying through the corridor. "The vault, Ms. Blackwood. Let's not waste time. We know about the time delay system, which is why we're here during the quarterly review, when those protocols are temporarily suspended for board member access." A muffled sob echoed from the lobby. Someone was having a panic attack. "Shut up!" one of the robbers shouted, followed by the sound of a sharp slap. Michael's jaw clenched. These men might have military training, but they'd forgotten the most important part of that training: protecting civilians. He thought about his last mission in Afghanistan, when his unit had been tasked with protecting a village from insurgents. They'd been outnumbered then too, but James had taught him something crucial. The element of surprise and a solid plan can overcome superior numbers. You just need to be patient, wait for your moment. Through the reflection, Michael watched the robbers' pattern of movement, noting their positions and timing. They were good, but they were also overconfident. They'd secured the obvious threats: Tom, the visible security measures, the exits, but they hadn't done a full sweep of the service areas. Why would they? The janitor wasn't worth their attention. That would be their fatal mistake. Michael removed his blue uniform jacket, the symbol of his invisibility in the bank. Underneath, his white t-shirt was stained with cleaning products, but his muscles were still combat-ready, maintained through years of physical labor. He wasn't the same Marine who'd served in Afghanistan, but he wasn't just the janitor either. He was something in between, someone who understood both worlds, and right now, that made him dangerous. As he prepared to move, Sarah's earlier words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the bravest thing is asking for help. But there was no help to ask for now. There was only him, his training, and a building full of innocent people who needed someone to act. Michael took a deep breath, centered himself, and made his decision. It was time to remind everyone, including himself, that a Marine never stops being a Marine, even when he's carrying a mop instead of a rifle. The element of surprise would only work once. He had to make it count. Michael moved through the maintenance tunnel with the silent efficiency that had once earned him a commendation for stealth operations. The narrow passage was thick with dust. Clearly, no one but him had been here in years. He could hear muffled voices above, the robbers coordinating their movements. Their leader was still pressuring Victoria to open the vault, his patience wearing thin. "I don't understand why it's not working." Victoria's voice trembled. "The code should override the time lock during board reviews." "Try again." The leader's voice was cold, controlled. "You have 1 minute before we demonstrate how serious we are to your employees." Michael paused at a junction in the tunnel, his mind racing. The vault's mechanical room was 30 feet ahead. He'd memorized the distance during his cleaning rounds. From there, he could access the vault area's electrical systems. More importantly, he could get behind the robber's position. But first, he needed a distraction. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone. During his time in Afghanistan, his unit had learned that the simplest plans often worked best. He dialed the bank's main number, knowing it would ring at every desk. The sound of multiple phones ringing simultaneously echoed through the building. "Check those calls," the leader barked. "Nobody answers." Michael heard footsteps above as one of the robbers moved to investigate. The diversion split their attention, exactly what he needed. He moved forward, using the building's blueprints etched in his memory to navigate. The maintenance tunnel opened into a small mechanical room filled with electrical panels and ventilation equipment. Through a vent near the ceiling, he could see into the vault area. 2 robbers were visible, the leader still with Victoria and another guarding the corridor. Both were heavily armed, confirming his suspicion about their military background. Their weapons were professional grade, their stance and grip showing extensive training. Michael's pulse remained steady as he assessed the situation. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that panic was a luxury you couldn't afford. He thought about the hostages in the lobby, Sarah, Tom, all the people who'd never given him a second glance but now depended on him without knowing it. He couldn't fail them. The electrical panel before him controlled not just power, but also the ventilation system. During his maintenance checks, he'd discovered that the vault area's air handling system was separate from the main building, a security measure that could now work in his favor. With careful precision, he began rerouting connections. Above, the situation was deteriorating. "Last chance, Ms. Blackwood." The leader's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "Open the vault or we start making examples." Victoria's response was cut short by a commotion from the lobby. "Sir," one of the robbers called out. "We've got movement on the street, possible police activity." "Stick to the plan," the leader commanded. "We've got time. The police can't approach without risking the hostages." Michael smiled grimly. They were good, but they'd made the classic mistake of becoming too focused on their original plan. In combat, adaptability often meant the difference between success and failure. He reached for the main ventilation control, remembering a lesson from his Marine training. Sometimes the best weapon isn't a weapon at all. With practiced movements, he cross-wired the ventilation system's circuits. The effect was immediate. A loud, grinding screech filled the vault area as the fans began to malfunction. Smoke from the overloading circuits poured through the vents, creating instant chaos. "What the hell?" The leader's voice showed the first signs of stress. "Check the systems." The guard in the corridor moved toward the mechanical room's door, exactly as Michael had anticipated. He waited, timing his breathing just as he had during close-quarters combat training. The door opened, and the guard stepped in, waving his hand to clear the smoke. Michael struck with military precision. The wrench connected with the guard's wrist, sending his weapon clattering to the floor. Before the man could shout, Michael's other hand clamped over his mouth, pulling him into a chokehold. The guard struggled, but Michael had positioned himself perfectly. Another lesson from combat. Within seconds, the man went limp. Quickly securing the unconscious guard with zip ties from the man's own pocket, Michael retrieved the fallen weapon. The familiar weight in his hands brought back a flood of memories, range qualifications, combat patrols, life and death moments in the desert. He pushed the memories aside, focusing on the present. Through the smoke, he could hear the leader shouting orders, trying to regain control of the situation. The other robbers were moving, their footsteps betraying their positions. The smoke was spreading through the ventilation system, creating confusion throughout the bank. "Find out what's happening," the leader commanded. "And someone get eyes on that janitor. Where the hell did he go?" For balance. But this wasn't a desert battlefield. It was a bank in Pine Grove, and the people counting on him weren't soldiers but civilians who'd never signed up for combat. "Check the maintenance area," the leader's voice cut through the smoke, "and get this ventilation system under control." 2 more robbers were approaching the mechanical room, their weapons ready. Michael could hear them coordinating their movements. Definitely military trained, probably special forces. In another life, they might have been brothers in arms. Now they were threats that needed to be neutralized. Michael moved to a better position, using the smoke for cover. The bank's emergency lights had activated, creating an eerie glow through the haze. He could hear frightened whispers from the hostages in the lobby, the sound of someone praying, a child quietly crying. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The first robber entered the mechanical room, sweeping his weapon in a practiced arc, but he was looking for a threat at eye level, not for a former Marine attacking from below. Michael struck from a crouch, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection, while simultaneously stripping away his weapon. The robber's head cracked against a pipe as he fell, and he went down hard. "Marcus, you good?" the second robber called from the doorway. Michael responded by throwing the unconscious man's radio through the smoke. As the second robber instinctively tracked the movement, Michael emerged from the opposite direction. The fight was brief but brutal, a flickering dance of combat-trained muscles and desperation. When it ended, both robbers were secured with their own zip ties, unconscious but alive. "All units report." The leader's voice crackled over the radio. "Someone tell me what the hell is happening." Michael keyed the radio, disguising his voice with the skills he'd learned in counterintelligence training. "South corridor clear. No sign of the target." Let them think their team was still in control. Confusion could be as effective as any weapon. In the vault area, he could hear Victoria still arguing with the leader. "The system's locked down completely now. I can't override it." "Then your employees start dying. Is that what you want?" Through a vent, Michael caught a glimpse of Sarah in the lobby. She was quietly calming the crying child, showing a courage that made his chest tighten. Tom caught his movement and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The old soldier had spotted him and was ready to help when needed. Michael checked his acquired weapon again, mentally counting rounds. 2 robbers down, 2 to go. The leader was the real threat. His voice carried the cold authority of someone who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. But first, Michael needed to secure the lobby. He used the maintenance tunnels to circle around, emerging behind a filing cabinet near the teller stations. The remaining robber in the lobby was growing nervous, his weapon moving erratically between hostages. A dangerous situation. Nervous men with guns made fatal mistakes. Michael looked at the scared faces of the people he cleaned up after every day. The loan officers who mocked him, the tellers who ignored him, the customers who looked through him. None of that mattered now. What mattered was getting them home safely. He thought of James, of their last conversation before that final mission. "What makes a real hero, Chen?" James had asked. "It's not about medals or glory. It's about being willing to act when everyone else is paralyzed by fear." The lobby robber was moving closer to his position, responding to a sound near the entrance. Michael timed his breathing, waited for the perfect moment, then emerged from cover. His first strike disabled the robber's weapon hand. The second took out his knee. The man went down with a muffled cry, but before he could alert the leader, Michael had him in a chokehold. "Stay down and stay quiet," Michael whispered, "or we find out if your medical insurance covers reconstructive surgery." The man went still, recognizing the voice of someone who meant every word. As Michael secured his third captive, he heard gasps from the hostages. They were staring at him, the invisible janitor, as if seeing him for the first time. Tom was already working his way free of his zip ties, ready to help secure the others. "Chen?" The whisper came from one of the loan officers who'd mocked him that very morning. Who are you?" "He's a Marine," Sarah answered proudly, her eyes meeting Michael's. "He's always been a Marine." But the moment of victory was short-lived. A shot rang out from the vault area, followed by Victoria's scream. The leader's voice carried clearly through the smoke. "I know you're out there, hero. Let's see how good you really are. You have 30 seconds to show yourself or the bank manager dies." Michael stood, checking his weapon one final time. The smoke was starting to clear, and sunlight was breaking through the bank's windows. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about recognition or redemption. He was thinking about James, about promises made and kept, about the fact that sometimes the most important battles are fought by those everyone else has forgotten. "Tom," he said quietly, "get these people to safety. I have a meeting in the vault." The final confrontation was waiting, and Michael Chen, janitor, veteran, Marine, was ready to remind everyone why you should never underestimate a quiet man with a mop and memories of war. Michael approached the vault area with measured steps, his mind clear and focused. The smoke was thinning now, streams of sunlight cutting through the haze like searchlights. Through the glass partition, he could see Victoria pressed against the vault door, the leader's weapon trained on her head. Even from this distance, Michael could read the man's posture. This wasn't just any veteran turned criminal. This was someone who'd commanded others, someone used to being in control. "That's far enough," the leader called out, his voice carrying the sharp edge of authority. "Drop your weapon and step into view, slowly." Michael analyzed the situation with combat-trained precision. The leader had positioned himself with clear sightlines to both entrances, leaving Victoria as a human shield. Professional. Tactical. But there was something else in his stance, a subtle tell that Michael recognized from his own mirrors. The weight of too many battles carried for too long. "I said drop it." The leader pressed his weapon harder against Victoria's temple, causing her to whimper. Her mascara had run down her cheeks, leaving black trails that made her look vulnerable in a way Michael had never seen before. "You know that's not happening," Michael replied, keeping his voice steady. "3 of your men are down. The hostages are being evacuated. It's over." A harsh laugh echoed through the vault area. "Over? You think because you got lucky with my men you understand the situation?" The leader shifted slightly, allowing Michael to catch a glimpse of his face. "You're just a janitor playing hero. What do you know about real combat?" "2nd Battalion, 6th Marines," Michael responded, letting his training show in his voice. "2 tours in Afghanistan. Purple Heart recipient. Want to compare service records?" The leader's posture changed subtly. Recognition between warriors. "Force recon," he said after a moment. 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. They gave me a Silver Star for valor." His laugh was bitter now. "Fat lot of good it did me when I came home to nothing. But you know all about that, don't you? All those skills, all that training, and where did it get you? Pushing a mop in a bank that doesn't even know your name." Victoria's eyes widened at this exchange, her gaze darting between the 2 men as understanding dawned. The janitor she'd dismissed and humiliated was something else entirely. "We all came home to fights we didn't expect," Michael acknowledged, inching forward. "But this isn't the answer. You're better than this." "Better?" The leader's voice cracked slightly. "I led men into battle. I made decisions that kept them alive. Now I can't even get a job in private security because I'm too intense. At least you found your place, janitor. Some of us couldn't adjust to being nothing." Michael thought about his own struggles, the nights spent staring at his service medals, the weight of invisibility. "We're not nothing," he said firmly. "And you know what you're doing is wrong. These aren't enemy combatants. They're civilians. This isn't a war zone." "It's all a war zone," the leader snarled, his composure cracking. "Different battlefield, same fight for survival. I planned this for months, it was perfect. Then you..." He paused, something like respect crossing his features. "You saw it coming, didn't you? All those times cleaning, watching, assessing, just like we were trained." "Old habits," Michael replied, thinking of his notebooks filled with security observations. "Hard to turn them off." Victoria had stopped trembling, her eyes fixed on Michael with a new understanding. The man she'd ordered around like a servant had been protecting them all along. "Last chance," the leader said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Walk away. You don't owe them anything. How many times have they looked through you? Treated you like you were invisible?" Michael took another step forward, memories of countless slights and humiliations flowing through his mind. "You're right," he admitted. "They never saw me. But that's not why we served, is it? We didn't take our oaths for recognition. We took them to protect people, even people who don't know they need protecting." The leader's hand tightened on his weapon, but Michael could see the conflict in his eyes. "Don't make me do this, Marine. You know I can't walk away now." "Yes, you can," Michael said firmly. "Remember who you are. Remember what that silver star means. This isn't you. This is the pain talking. Trust me, I know. Every day I clean these floors, I fight the same battle you're fighting now. The battle to remember our worth." For a moment, the only sound was the distant wail of police sirens. Then the leader's voice came again, quieter now. "How do you do it? How do you keep going when everything that made you who you are seems worthless?" "By remembering that what we are isn't about the uniform," Michael answered, thinking of James, of all the brothers and sisters in arms who never made it home. "It's about the oath we took, the values we lived by. That doesn't end when the war does." Victoria had stopped crying, her eyes moving between the two men as decades of combat experience and shared pain hung in the air between them. The leader's weapon lowered slightly, just a fraction, but enough. Michael moved with the speed that had earned him commendations in combat. His first strike knocked the weapon aside. His second broke the leader's grip on Victoria. She scrambled away as the two men engaged in a brutal display of military combat training. Each blow precise, each counter measured. Two warriors who'd walked the same paths now meeting as opponents. But Michael had found something the leader had lost. A purpose beyond the pain. In protecting others, he'd protected himself from the darkness that had claimed so many veterans. When the fight ended, he held his fellow warrior in a restraining hold, speaking quietly in his ear. "It's over, brother. But this isn't the end of your story. Trust me on that." The leader's resistance finally ceased, and as Michael secured him, tears were running down the fallen warrior's face. Sometimes the biggest battles weren't fought with weapons at all. The aftermath of the crisis unfolded like a surreal dream. SWAT teams poured into the bank, their tactical gear and weapons a stark contrast to Michael's simple maintenance uniform. He stood quietly by the wall, watching as they secured the scene and led away the captured robbers. The leader caught his eye one last time as they took him out, a look of recognition between warriors that spoke volumes. Victoria Blackwood hadn't moved far from the vault area, her usually impeccable appearance disheveled, her hands still trembling slightly. She kept glancing at Michael as if seeing a stranger wearing a familiar face. The woman who had commanded him with such casual disdain just hours ago now seemed unable to find her voice. "Mr. Chen," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say." Michael met her gaze steadily. "You don't need to say anything, Ms. Blackwood." "But I do," she insisted, her composure cracking. "All this time, the way I treated you, I never knew. I never even asked about your service." She paused, swallowing hard. "You saved my life today. You saved all of us. And I don't even know your first name." "Michael," he said quietly. "It's Michael." Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Captain Reynolds of the Pine Grove Police Department. The captain was a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone who'd seen his share of combat. He took one look at Michael and recognized a fellow veteran. "Walk me through it, Marine," Reynolds said, his tone respectful. As Michael recounted the events, a small crowd gathered. Police officers, bank employees, even some of the rescued hostages who hadn't yet given their statements. He could see the loan officers who had mocked him that very morning, their faces now showing a mix of shame and awe. Sarah pushed through the crowd, ignoring the officers trying to keep people back, and threw her arms around Michael in a tight hug. "I knew it," she whispered fiercely. "I always knew there was more to you than they could see." Tom joined them, now helping the police with securing the scene. "When I saw you moving through that smoke," he said, shaking his head in admiration, "it was like watching a ghost. Beautiful tactical work, brother." Captain Reynolds finished taking notes and closed his notebook. "Your actions saved a lot of lives today," he said seriously. "But I'm more impressed by how you handled the leader. Not many would have tried to talk him down like that. Most would have just taken the shot." Michael thought about the look in the leader's eyes, the pain he'd recognized there. "He was one of us," he said simply. "Lost his way, but still one of us." "Speaking of which," Reynolds continued, "I understand you've been working here as a janitor." He shared a look with Victoria, who had the grace to flush. "Seems like a waste of your skills. The department's been looking to expand our tactical training program, teach our officers some real-world expertise. We could use someone with your background." Before Michael could respond, Sarah interjected. "And my brother's veteran support group needs more counselors, people who really understand what it's like to come home." "I've got a better idea," Tom said, stepping forward. "Why not both? This bank's security needs a complete overhaul after today. Who better to run it than someone who already knows every weakness in the system?" Victoria nodded eagerly, perhaps too eagerly. "Yes, absolutely. We'll create a new position, Head of Security Operations. Full benefits, substantial raise, complete authority over security protocols." She paused, meeting Michael's eyes. If you're interested." Michael looked around at the faces watching him expectantly. The invisible man was suddenly the center of attention, but it didn't feel right. This wasn't about redemption or recognition. It was about something more fundamental. "The bank job," he said slowly. "Would it leave time for other work? The police training? The veteran support?" Reynolds smiled. "We can make it work. These guys need what you have to offer. Not just your tactical skills, but your understanding. What happened here today proved that." Michael thought about the leader's words about feeling worthless after coming home. How many other veterans were out there, struggling with the same battles? How many needed someone to remind them that their worth didn't end with their service? Sarah squeezed his arm gently. "You won't have to choose," she said softly. "You can be both, the protector and the healer. Isn't that what Marines do?" A memory flashed through Michael's mind. James, standing in the Afghan sun, telling him that the greatest honor wasn't in the medals they received, but in the lives they touched. Maybe this was what his friend had meant. Maybe this was why he'd ended up here, invisible, until the moment he needed to be seen. "I'll need to keep my maintenance access," he said finally, a slight smile touching his lips. "Some of the best security observations come from a janitor's perspective." The relief in the room was palpable. Victoria looked like she might cry again, but this time from gratitude. Tom clapped him on the shoulder, and Sarah's smile could have lit up the darkened bank. Captain Reynolds extended his hand. "Welcome aboard, Marine. Though something tells me janitor was never really your job title here. More like undercover guardian angel." As Michael shook the captain's hand, he caught his reflection in the bank's windows. The tired janitor was still there, but now he stood straighter, his purpose clear at last. Sometimes the longest battles weren't fought with weapons or won with tactical brilliance. Sometimes they were fought every day, in quiet moments, until you finally found your place in a world that had seemed to forget you. He was ready to fight those battles too. 1 month after the bank robbery, First Regional Bank had changed in ways that went far beyond its upgraded security systems. Michael Chen's office, a converted storage room he'd insisted on keeping rather than taking Victoria's offered executive suite, had become a strange kind of gathering place. The small space somehow managed to bridge the gaps between bank employees, local law enforcement, and the veteran community that had previously existed in separate worlds. On this particular morning, Michael sat at his desk, reviewing security protocols while glancing occasionally at the framed photograph now hanging on his wall. It showed his old unit in Afghanistan, with James standing beside him. Next to it was a newer photo, Michael in his maintenance uniform, surrounded by the bank employees on his last day as a janitor. The contrast between the two images told a story of its own. "Got a minute?" Tom's voice came from the doorway. The security guard, now deputy head of security under Michael, entered with a fresh cup of coffee. "The first batch of police cadets is starting tactical training next week. Captain Reynolds wants to know if you're ready." Michael nodded, thinking about the training program he'd designed. It wasn't just about teaching police officers military tactics. It was about helping them understand the human element of crisis situations. "We'll start with the basics," he said. "Sometimes the best tactical advantage is understanding what's going on in your opponent's head." "Speaking of understanding," Tom said carefully, "did you hear about Davidson?" He was referring to the robbery's leader whose trial was approaching. "I visited him last week," Michael replied quietly. The former Force Recon Marine had broken down during their conversation, revealing a story of PTSD, failed relationships, and a system that had left him behind. He's agreed to speak at the Veteran Support Group. His experience might help others who are struggling. Sarah appeared in the doorway carrying a stack of files. She'd recently taken on a role as liaison between the bank and local veteran services, inspired by what had happened during the robbery. "The new security training schedule is ready," she announced, "and you won't believe who just made a substantial donation to the Veteran Support Program." "Victoria," Michael said with a slight smile. The bank manager had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. Her previous dismissive attitude had been replaced by a genuine commitment to supporting veteran causes. "She's in the lobby," Sarah added, "personally welcoming a group of veteran job applicants. Remember how she used to be about image?" Michael remembered all too well. But people could surprise you. He'd learned that in war and peace alike. Victoria had approached him the week after the robbery, tears in her eyes, and shared how her own father had been a Vietnam veteran who'd struggled to adjust after coming home. She'd buried those memories so deeply that she'd lost sight of what they meant. The bank's transformation had rippled out into the community. Other businesses in Pine Grove had started their own veteran hiring initiatives. The police department's new training program was drawing attention from neighboring cities. But most importantly, veterans who had been suffering in silence were finally finding their voices. "Chief Coleman's here to see you," Tom announced, referring to the newly promoted head of Pine Grove Police. "Says it's about expanding the tactical training program to include crisis negotiation." Michael stood, straightening his new uniform, a subtle charcoal gray that marked him as security chief, while remaining deliberately understated. He'd insisted on keeping it simple, remembering how the most effective operators he'd known never needed flash to command respect. As he walked through the bank's lobby, he noticed the changes that went beyond physical security upgrades. Employees who had once walked past him without a glance now stood straighter, showed more awareness of their surroundings. They'd learned that strength often came in unexpected forms, and that true security wasn't just about locks and cameras. The former janitor's closet, his old domain, had been converted into a small break room for the maintenance staff, his first action as security chief. The new janitor, a young veteran named Rodriguez, was treated with the respect that Michael had once been denied. Sometimes the biggest changes started in the smallest places. "Remember when you told me being strong doesn't mean carrying everything alone?" Michael said to Sarah as they walked. "You were right. But sometimes it takes a crisis to remind us that we're all carrying something." They passed the spot where the robbery had reached its climax. The vault area now featured enhanced security measures, but also something else, a small plaque dedicated to fallen veterans. It had been Victoria's idea, a reminder that service didn't end when the uniform came off. "Your sister called," Sarah mentioned. "She's flying in next week for the ceremony." The Pine Grove Veteran Support Center was opening, funded partly by the bank, partly by community donations. Michael would be splitting his time between bank security and veteran counseling, a balance that felt right. As they reached the lobby, Michael saw a familiar face among the veteran job applicants, a former Marine who'd recently been sleeping rough behind the local diner. The man's eyes lit up with recognition. Word had spread through the veteran community about the janitor who'd never stopped being a Marine, who'd found a way to bridge the gap between who they'd been and who they could still become. Michael took a moment to look around the bank, his bank, in a way he'd never imagined possible. The floors still needed mopping, the windows still needed cleaning, but now those tasks were just part of a larger mission. He thought about James, about their last conversation about what made a real hero. "It's not about the recognition," he told his friend's grave on his last visit. "It's about being ready when it matters, about remembering who you are, even when others forget." The morning sun streamed through the bank's windows, catching the small purple heart pin he now wore on his uniform collar, not as a symbol of past glory, but as a reminder that every day brought new battles worth fighting. Some were fought with weapons and tactics, others with mops and patience, but all were part of the same endless mission: to protect, to serve, and to remind others that worth isn't measured by uniform or rank, but by the heart that beats beneath them. Michael Chen had finally found his post-war mission, and somewhere, he knew, James was smiling. 6 months after the attempted bank robbery, Pine Grove had become a different kind of town. The story of the veteran janitor who saved First Regional Bank, well, he approached quietly, offering the same understanding that Sarah had once offered him. Sometimes the greatest acts of heroism weren't dramatic rescues or tactical victories, but simply being there when someone needed to be seen. The center had become more than just a building. It was a bridge between worlds, a place where the invisible became visible, where broken spirits found healing, and where veterans discovered that their greatest service might still lie ahead. Michael Chen, once just a janitor with a hidden past, had become a different kind of warrior, one who fought not with weapons, but with understanding, not for territory, but for souls. And in this new mission, every day brought its own kind of victory. 1 year after the bank robbery that changed everything, Michael Chen stood in front of First Regional Bank as the morning sun painted the sky in shades of promise. The building looked the same, but felt different, transformed not just by enhanced security systems, but by the spirits of the people within. He pulled out his old maintenance keys, running his thumb over their worn edges before placing them in an envelope. Today would be his last day carrying them. Inside, the bank was coming to life. Sarah was setting up a special display in the lobby, photographs documenting the year's journey from crisis to transformation. There he was in his janitor's uniform, then in tactical gear during police training sessions, and finally speaking at veteran events across the country. The story of the invisible hero had taken on a life of its own, becoming a beacon of hope for veterans struggling to find their place. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Tom said, joining him by the display. The security office, once a tiny monitoring station, had evolved into a state-of-the-art command center. But more importantly, it had become a place where veterans could find purpose, turning their hypervigilance into a professional asset. Victoria emerged from her office, no longer the cold executive who had dismissed Michael's worth. The bank's veteran hiring program, now a model for institutions nationwide, had transformed not just policies, but personalities. "The governor's office called again," she announced. "They want you to head the state's new veteran integration program." Michael nodded, thinking about how far they'd all come. The day's ceremony would mark the official launch of a nationwide initiative inspired by Pine Grove's success. Banks across the country were adopting their veteran-inclusive security model, recognizing that some of the best protectors were those who had once felt forgotten. "Did you hear about Davidson?" Sarah asked, adjusting a photo frame. The former bank robber had become an unlikely catalyst for change. From his prison cell, he'd developed a program helping veterans transition from military to civilian life, preventing others from following his path to desperation. His sentence had been reduced in recognition of his contributions to veteran rehabilitation. The sound of a mop bucket's wheels caught Michael's attention. Rodriguez was teaching a new hire, another veteran, the proper maintenance protocols that doubled as security rounds. The janitor's closet now had a discreet plaque. "Every position is a position of honor." It had become a tradition for new employees to start their training there, regardless of their eventual role. "Chief Reynolds is here," Tom announced. The police chief entered with several officials from neighboring cities, all eager to learn from Pine Grove's transformed approach to community security. The department's veteran integrated training program had reduced incident rates while increasing public trust. They'd learned that sometimes the best way to prevent conflict was to understand its roots. Michael took a moment to visit his old office, the converted storage room he'd insisted on keeping even as his responsibilities grew. The walls held memories, his Purple Heart beside James's photo, the mop handle he'd used during the robbery mounted like a sacred relic, and countless letters from veterans who'd found hope in his story. "You've got mail," Sarah said, handing him an envelope. Inside was a letter from James Davidson, writing from the prison where he was serving his reduced sentence. "Your story saved my life twice," it read. "First, when you stopped me from making an unforgivable mistake, and then when you showed me there was still a way to serve with honor." The ceremony that afternoon was more than just a promotional event. Veterans from across the country filled the bank's lobby, each with their own story of finding purpose after service. Rodriguez presented Michael with his old janitor's uniform, now framed alongside his new credentials as Executive Director of Veteran Services. "A year ago," Michael began his speech, "I stood in this lobby with a mop in my hands, invisible to most who passed by. Today, I stand here not because we all learned to see differently." He paused, looking at the gathered faces. "We learned that strength wears many uniforms, that honor exists in every position, and that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen in the quietest moments." Victoria stepped forward, unveiling a new sign above the bank's entrance. "First Regional Bank, where service never ends." It was more than a slogan. It was a promise to recognize the worth in every veteran, every employee, every person who walked through their doors. "But this isn't the end of our story," Michael continued. "It's just the beginning. Because every day, veterans are coming home, looking for their place, fighting battles we can't see. Our job, all of us, is to show them that their service didn't end with their uniform, that their worth isn't measured by their position, and that there's honor in every way we choose to serve." As the applause faded and people mingled, Michael took one last walk through the bank's corridors. The floors still needed mopping, the windows still needed cleaning, but now these tasks were seen differently, not as menial labor, but as part of a larger mission of protection and service. He stopped at the vault area, where the final confrontation had taken place. A small memorial plaque honored all veterans, with words that had become the bank's unofficial motto. "True strength isn't always visible. True service never ends. True heroes often walk among us unnoticed." Michael Chen had gone from invisible janitor to recognized leader, but his most important role remained unchanged, being a bridge between worlds, showing others that every position held dignity, every person had value, and every day brought new opportunities to serve. The sun was setting as he finally left the bank, casting long shadows that reminded him of that fateful day a year ago. But now the shadows didn't hide invisible men. They highlighted the path forward for all who served, in whatever uniform they chose to wear. Some battles are fought with weapons, others with mops and patience. But the greatest victories are won in the quiet moments when we remember who we are, what we stand for, and how many lives we touch simply by refusing to forget our worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.